Knowing the Truth with Pastor Kevin Bowling is a live call-in radio program providing doctrinal dialogue, cultural commentary, and insightful interviews with some of today's foremost Christian authors and leaders. Knowing the Truth is the outreach ministry of the Mountain Bridge Bible Fellowship in Travelers Rest. The goal of the church and the radio program is to seek the glory of God in the salvation of sinners and the sanctification of the saints by the ministry of the Word. For more information, go to www.knowingthetruth.org. Here with today's edition of Knowing the Truth is Pastor Kevin Bowling.
Welcome into this edition of the Knowing the Truth radio program. This is Pastor Kevin Bowling. So glad that you joined us on the broadcast here today. I'm doing another interview today in preparation for an upcoming conference that's coming here to the upstate of South Carolina, and specifically right here in the Greenville area. It's actually in a little suburb of Greenville called Taylors. But in Taylors, there's going to be a conference called In 6 Days. In 6 Days is the title of the conference. And the subtitle there is A Creation Event 2019. And so it's going to deal with various aspects of creation. And there's going to be a number of speakers at the event. Tom DeRosa, I've already aired an interview from Tom. And James Wanliss joins me now. James is going to be speaking at this event as well. By the way, the event is going to take place on May 10th and 11th. So it's coming up very shortly, May 10th and 11th on Friday evening. I mentioned that Tom DeRosa is going to speak on Friday. James is going to be speaking on Saturday. And when James speaks on Saturday, his title of his presentation on Saturday morning is going to be Radioactive Dating of Dinosaurs. Now, anytime dinosaurs are mentioned, there's always a lot of interest because people are just very interested for some reason about dinosaurs. So that's very good. However, the radioactive part, that's probably the part that people don't know that much about. They hear it all the time. They hear, scientists say that something was tested and it's 5 million years old or something. And I think sometimes they just kind of roll their eyes. They're not quite sure how they come to that conclusion and so forth. So we wanted to talk to James a little bit today about radioactive dating and have him just give us in layman's terms a little bit better understanding and whet our appetite for the upcoming conference that's going to take place here very shortly, as I mentioned, on May 10th and 11th. James is a professor of physics and computer science at Presbyterian College. And James, I remember last time that I had you on to talk about your book, The Green Dragon, that you had to give a little bit of a disclaimer because, and this happens sometimes when we work, I talk to professors, they have to do it as well. So I'll let you give your disclaimer about that you speak for yourself and so forth, and then we can go ahead and start our discussion.
Thanks, Kevin. It's good to be with you today. The book, Resisting the Green Dragon, roused a little bit of heat, and so some people don't like that, and so I have to make sure that whenever I speak, the college that I work for is recognized as not necessarily endorsing anything that I have to say.
Hey, they do it at the end of my broadcast. There's always a statement at the end that the station does not necessarily endorse the what I said during the broadcast and so forth. So be it.
That's good.
I can understand that, I guess.
Thank you.
So let me ask you about this radioactive. Give us some good working definitions. What are we talking about when we're talking about this subject?
Sure. So we have different views of the world, different cosmologies, right? The ideas of how everything came to be that we know of in the cosmos, the universe. So that's cosmology. I was speaking yesterday to my students about something called the Jain cosmology, the Jain religion, Jain. They, in their religious book, the Mahapurana, it actually says, know that creation is eternal as time itself. They have this idea that the cosmos itself has no beginning and no end.
I think Carl Sagan said something like that.
Well, Big Bang cosmology is the cosmology that's the standard definition in secular world today. And that cosmology holds that everything began roughly 13.6 billion years ago.
Billion.
And that everything would include radiation as well. There was a Big Bang, apparently. And the name actually Big Bang comes. It was a pejorative. It was a joke. A physicist called Fred Hoyle was on BBC being interviewed, and he mocked that. He was a believer in something that was far more akin to that ancient Jain cosmology, steady state universe. And he said, how can nothing go bang? It's a Big Bang. But people ran with it, and that's the cosmology that dominates the secular world today. In a 6-day creation, we have a totally different view, right? God created all things roughly, 2,000 years ago in 6 days, and all very good. Whatever the method of creation, no matter what cosmology one subscribes to, there is radiation. And so that radiation has been with us since the beginning of time to the present, and it's something that we're intimately involved with all day.
So if you have matter, you have radiation?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. We can measure radiation from distilled water, for instance. People are saying, well, don't bring me near radiation. Well, my favorite fruit is bananas, and they are loaded with potassium, and you bring a Geiger counter, which is a special instrument which I'll actually be demonstrating at the conference, which is able to measure radiation. That thing will start clicking like crazy if you bring it near bananas, because they're loaded with radiation. And so is your body, in fact. Your bones are radioactive.
I bought a piece of property that at some point on the property it had some power lines that were running through it. So I was concerned about the power lines. So I asked the power company if I could have somebody come out with a meter and test for me what the reading would be at near the power lines and so forth. I was shocked to find out that the readings were lower there, even though high power lines running above, because of the distance that they're up into the air and so forth, than they were. I was living in Greenville at the time, so before I bought this house, I was living in Greenville, in a subdivision in Greenville. The ratings were higher in that subdivision in Greenville with no power lines running above it than they were here. And because of the underground power lines, it was really high in my kitchen towards the microwave. A couple feet from the microwave, I got a high reading right there. So it's everywhere, right?
Yes, and there's two different types of radiation. So that's very interesting that you mentioned that, because people have all kinds of misconceptions. There's a lot of hysteria, especially with social media, which has accelerated the rate at which people can get hysterical about things.
True.
So there's two major types of radiation that we deal with in our life. Right now, we are being radiated. You couldn't see me if it weren't for the radiation that is bouncing off my face into your retina, into your eye. And so that radiation is electromagnetic radiation. That's one type. An example of that is the lights from electricity or the light from the sun. Both of those are electromagnetic radiation. And any wire that has electricity running through it, like this wire, is going to be emitting electromagnetic radiation. Light. That's just light. So people will freak out. But radiation, light radiation, electromagnetic radiation is simply light. Some of that radiation is harmful to us. So for instance, if we go sit outside in July, let's say, the whole day, we're going to be burned pretty bad. And that's because of ultraviolet radiation.
Okay.
That's light. Some people will pay good money to actually sit under tanning lamps.
Exactly.
They're getting ultraviolet radiation. So too much of a good thing is not good.
It's a bad thing.
So that's electromagnetic radiation, and we have other light radiation that's coming off us, called infrared radiation, which we're not able to see. God didn't design us to be able to see that, but it is there.
And with hunting, I've used infrared scopes and so forth, and see animals. You can even see their heart beating, because of the power of the infrared and thermal imaging. So the physics behind that is exactly the same for every single type of electromagnetic radiation. That radiation is coming off us. Our bodies are emitting light. So we're basically, it's incredible if you think about it. God created man. God made out of this ground this creature and breathed into him life. And everything that has life is emitting radiation. So our flesh, which has been compressed, is in a sense compressed light. It's been ground, squeezed down into these bodies, and then our bodies are burning, and we're giving off radiation all the time. Light radiation. The light of him. That's interesting. Showing forth the light, right? Yeah. And we don't see the light,
unless you wear the special infrared goggles. Our eyes are not designed to see that, but it's there. We're like candles burning.
Interesting.
So that's electromagnetic radiation. And we could go on to X-rays, gamma rays. Those are types of electromagnetic radiation. So usually when people speak about radiation that is bad, they're usually talking about things like X-rays or gamma rays. And these are technically what we would say are ionizing radiation. That is to say, when that light hits us, it is able to knock an electron off, so basically change the structure of the atoms. Whereas normally if some light hits us, we sit outside in the sun, we feel that you actually develop electric currents in your skin and you feel warmth. That's an electromagnetic reaction. As the radiation between your body, you have electric currents developing in your body which
altering the structure of the cell.
Well, it won't alter the structure of the cell, but it results in motion. And motion corresponds to warmth, heat.
Yeah.
Exactly. But the higher there's certain properties of the light, the higher the so-called frequency of the radiation. That is, how many times the radiation comes by, like a wave on the beach, how many times it slaps against the beach per second. If it's faster, that is higher energy radiation. And the higher and higher that becomes, we get to a point where it's able to actually knock off, change the structure of the atom. And that's ionizing radiation. And that's the stuff that if it's an X-ray or gamma ray, that will actually do damage to our cells, potentially.
I see. So they wear the lead vest because it won't go through the lead.
Exactly. So that's one type of radiation. The second type of radiation is particle radiation. So around about the 1800s, late 1800s, people had come to this new understanding of what matter is made up of. The ancient Greeks had their cosmology, and in their cosmology, they said, some of them, that water is the basic fundamental structure of nature, right? Earth, wind, water, and fire. And water became, to some, the fundamental. And in the late 1800s, people realized that the Greeks weren't too far off, because we discovered hydrogen and we understood a lot about the properties of hydrogen. And that's the simplest of all the atoms, the Legos, if you like, the building blocks of creation. And you can click these different Legos together in various ways, and they make certain structures which we then able to see. But in the late 1800s, they found that some of these atoms actually disintegrate. They thought that hydrogen was the simplest thing, and that's the simplest Lego. You get bigger ones, you clip them together, and you can make up different types of structures like CO2, carbon dioxide, or H2O, water. And those are different Legos, if you like, being stuck together. But they found that that some strange things seem to be coming off, emanating from certain types of atoms. And they identified radiation. So they identified gamma rays, very high energy light that's coming off. It's simply light. So you'd shine it on something, it would be light, just like the light that is radiating us right now. But they found others as well. One was alpha radiation, which is essentially the nucleus of a helium atom. And they found beta radiation, which can be an electron. And so that was revolutionary, because people had thought that the hydrogen atom was the basic building block. That's the atom, and then more and more complex versions of that. And not too far from the ancient Greeks. The ancient Greeks were 67% correct, if you think about it. H2O.
Right.
It's 2 out of 3.
They're close. No.
But the nuclear revolution that the physicists discovered, like Lord Rutherford and others, was that the atom itself is mainly empty space, and sometimes things can break off it which are smaller than that hydrogen atom. And those smaller things are gamma radiation, which is light. It's not a thing. It's hard to specify that, because you see the light, but you can't weigh it. That's correct.
Okay.
And then actual matter radiation. So when somebody talks about radiation, we know that light can burn us, just like ultraviolet. Fine. We appreciate the benefits of fire and light. We just don't we respect it. Right? We don't shine lasers into our eyes and things like that. It'll do some damage. And the matter radiation, the so-called alpha radiation and beta radiation, those are just very, very fast-moving particles. I put little quotes on it because nobody's ever seen an electron. Nobody's ever seen an alpha particle. Nobody's actually ever seen a hydrogen atom.
It's all theoretical.
There's a lot of evidence for it, but we have great difficulty actually visualizing it. So if you ever see pictures in textbooks of radiation, they'll show you little lines and arrows and so on because we don't have pictures of it. We have evidence. So for instance, you can shine a light on a photographic plate, for those of us who remember those, and you can get an image. Or you can shine gamma rays on something or shine X-rays through a human being and you see some picture behind.
Right.
So something was shone.
Right.
We can shoot alpha particles and we can shoot beta particles, electrons, and we also see effects. And the interpretation is, helium nucleus. They're very, very fast-moving particles. And so if you throw a baseball really slowly at me, I can probably catch it. If you throw it too fast at me, it's going to blast a hole right through me. That's what ionizing radiation does.
Okay. And this comes down to not so much with the evolutionists and so forth, not questioning whether there is this radiation, but how do we measure it, right? And talk about that.
Sure.
We have maybe about 10 minutes or less left in the program, but this measurement seems to be really where the rub is, right?
Yes, so the physicists who were studying radiation discovered something remarkable. They would watch the material which was giving off radiation. And remember now what I mean by giving off radiation, it was shooting alphas or betas or gammas out. You're doing that. In fact, your body is giving off about 60 gamma rays every minute. So one every second is typical for an average human being.
Okay.
You're shooting it. If that hits me, what am I going to do?
Put up your shield.
Yeah, put up my shield. What they discovered was if you weighed some radioactive material, radium, say, that's the name of a particular radioactive element which we know very well shoots off radioactive material. We could weigh that very, very carefully, and we can count the amount of radiation totally surrounded by sensors, counters, which measure, like the Geiger counter I'll demonstrate, which measure the radiation. And you could count how many times you observe something coming off, all right? And then you can keep measuring the weight of the material, and you can measure, the material actually changes. It so-called transmutes. You know, like Newton had this dream of transmuting base metals into gold. Yeah. Right? The philosopher's stone. Right. Well, that's what we found with radiation. You could take these materials. It would start as one thing. You watch it for a while and you keep measuring, and this radiation is coming off. You can count how many things come off it. But then, let's say you started with 100 atoms of the original type of material, called, let's say, radium. You waited and you waited and you waited and you counted. After a certain amount of time, you would only have 50%. Let's say we started with 100 of the original. After a certain amount of time, you'd have 50. We call that time the half-life.
Okay.
After that same amount of time elapses again, they counted and they found that now that original parent has dropped by another half. So you only have 50 divided by 2, or 25 atoms. So that same time, a remarkable thing was found there. And then after that same time again, 25 divided by 2, so about 12, and then 6, and then 3. And so what physicists do is you'll plot that on a curve. That's the radioactive decay curve. They found that. And every single radioactive element that we've observed, everything that's giving off alpha, betas, or gammas, follows some kind of curve. The curves have different times over which they drop. So there's different half-lives. And so if you know how many original atoms you have, and you come back some later time, and you count how many you now have, essentially by measuring the weight of the material or some other way,
sure,
you can say, how much time has gone by, if you know the half-life, because you've studied that particular material.
Okay.
So by measuring the half-life and by measuring the number of atoms in the material that we have, the number of parents and the number of daughters that they change into, you can get an estimate of how long that process has been going on. So, you know, if I were to pour water, if you were to watch water dripping into a cup, and you saw the thing from the beginning, you could see so many drops per second. We wouldn't have to worry. We could go to bed, come back, and we could tell time by that. We'd come back in the next day and see, oh, how much water is in there. If it's dropping at this much,
sure,
I can figure out how long that took.
If you know the rate that it's dropping
exactly,
at, and if that rate is consistent.
Exactly.
And you knew how much you had in there in the beginning.
Exactly.
If you knew those variables, then it all works out.
You're getting to a really important point, because that's part of the problem. There are a number of problems, but there's always assumptions when we make measurements in science, right? And one of the assumptions is, if you know how much water is in when you start measuring, fine. But if you just show up at some later point, you don't know how many there were necessarily to begin with. Or if somebody poured some of that water out during the night, you could come up with a great measurement. You could say, I know exactly how much time went by. But somebody says, Kevin, I poured out some of the water, and you go, oh no.
Throws the whole calc off.
Throws the whole calculation off.
Yes.
And so there's a number of assumptions, and these are some of the things that we'll talk about, right, with radioactive dating.
Okay.
If we have things coming in or out of the system,
Yep.
if some fundamental constants of the universe are not fundamental, then we have issues.
It doesn't seem like there's much in our world that remains constant like that. So it seems highly likely that there's going to be a number of different variables that are going to come into play. And I imagine you're going to deal with some of those during the conference.
That's right.
Well, we're looking forward to it. That was quite an education, and I hope our listeners understand that at this conference you're going to get that level of presentation that's going to be made during the conference. I mean, that's you're gonna come out of here with a PhD in something, I think, at the end of the conference. So that was very interesting, James. Thanks so much.
You're most welcome.
Really appreciate you coming in today to do the broadcast, and looking forward to the conference. Let me just tell the listening audience one more time before we close out the broadcast for today that I'm talking about the In 6 Days Conference, a creation event 2019. It's going to take place at GPC, that's the Greenville Presbyterian Church. It's located at 400 East Main Street in Taylors. The date of the event is going to be Friday and Saturday. It's just one presentation on Friday evening from 7 to 8:30. That's Friday, May 10th, and then Saturday, May 11th. And the presentations on Saturday will go throughout the day on Saturday. And then on Sunday, right here at GPC, Reverend Rob McCurley is going to also be speaking about a couple topics related to this subject in the morning worship service, and then again in the afternoon. We'll talk a little bit more about that on a subsequent broadcast. Thanks for joining us for another edition of the Knowing the Truth radio broadcast.